point is when Nebuchadnezzar took over and came up through Jerusalem, his father died, and that's when he inherited the throne of Babylon. But at the Battle of Carmel, he defeated a guy by the name of Pharaoh Necho.
Yep.
Pharaoh Necho was an Ethiopian.
Yep.
So the story goes, at that particular time, when the Ethiopians occupied Israel, was that the time that the ark disappeared, and they claim today that the ark is in Ethiopia.
I don't know. I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
Is that where did you find that from?
Yeah.
I mean, is that just from information? Is it the research you've done?
Just a little research.
Yeah. That would be
That's
interesting.
interesting.
I'm familiar with the battle because we're going to talk a little bit about that.
I could never locate Carmel, so I have no idea where that's at.
Isn't
It's
it
gotta
on
be
Old
right here.
Island?
Carchemish is right here. So Aleppo is
Okay.
here. Babylon is there. So Jerusalem's here. So it's right here.
Yeah.
Carchemish, which is interesting because. So what if you remember, was it Nebuchadnezzar had gone and was going after Jerusalem, and then Jehoiakim decided to rebel, and then before the rebellion, though, my understanding is that Nebuchadnezzar was up in Carchemish about to take Carchemish out, and then once he heard that Jehoiakim was rebelling, he came down and took out the next group of people, next exiles. But yeah, I don't know. So the idea is that the ark's down here somewhere.
But my timeline was, I don't know if the ark appeared in Scripture after that point. I just couldn't.
I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to look into that.
But that's what the Ethiopians claim that they have got hold of the ark today.
Yeah. Huh. It's just that side of history is just amazing how it all kind of pulls in, ties in.
It's even amazing if you figure, how did an Ethiopian ever get big Pharaoh of Egypt? But then you got to get into it. It's a little important.
I know it's yeah.
Well, was Egypt
It's like
there
a
after the ark?
Pardon?
Was Egypt there after the ark? I mean, what was the scope of the flood?
well. The flood was before the ark, way before the ark.
Oh,
Are you talking about? He's talking about the not the ark as in Noah's ark.
Yeah, I was
No. No. Okay.
you're talking about the covenant.
Yes. Not
It's a
yeah.
big town.
Well beyond the.
So we're all Ethiopians.
And there you go. Yeah, there we are.
Do we know what the world population was at that time or in that area? It's hard for me to fathom why those people would want to, on foot, go from that far across that type of terrain. Why would they even want to do that?
They didn't want to do that. What are you talking about? What people are you talking about?
Everybody. I mean, they're marching around and having wars with each other and having battles. That's a lot of work, and that's a lot of
It's a lot of work. Well, they needed resources, right? They needed land and resources. And
Power and
I
plunder.
don't understand it.
Yeah.
What's going to do? There wasn't YouTube.
Right. I mean, it's all about
It
power.
wasn't easy traveling, so it makes
No.
you wonder why in the world did
Yeah.
they even have trade routes. But
Yeah. Well, the kings they wanted more power and land and money and resources.
It would have been pretty cool to see
But it wasn't
animals,
like millions of people?
elephants coming and invade.
I don't think so. So to give you a perspective, then last week when we were talking about Hezekiah and him going back, it was about 50,000 people that went with him in that first return back. But it's I mean there are stats about how many people were there at that point, but I'm not sure exactly right now.
yeah.
Could you? I mean, if you got to think, there's probably a lot of fallout from this point all the way to here and back. Because to think about if Nebuchadnezzar was up here in Carchemish, and then he decided to come to Jerusalem, and then he goes back up to Carchemish, and then they head back over to Babylon, and that's
That would take years.
everything's so compact here, right? It's like when you read the Bible, it seems like just things are happening one day after another. But yeah, you're right. It could be months of travel in between, and
Yeah.
especially if you're moving a large army from one group, and then all the resources of that. All right, we might as well get into the scripture. All right, let's see here. Where do we want to start? We'll go through. let me read a little bit, and then I'll have you guys read here as well. But in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had many dreams. His mind was disturbed, and he suffered from insomnia. The king issued an order to summon the magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and wise men in order to explain his dreams to him, so they came and awaited the king's instructions. Your text may have you may have charmers and enhancers and enchanters and everything related to that, but depends. We'll talk about that here in a second. The king told them, I have had a dream, and I am anxious to understand the dream. The wise men replied to the king. And this is where we get the switch from Hebrew to Aramaic. You may have that note in your Bible. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will disclose its interpretation. Okay, we'll stop right there and talk a little bit about what's going on with this part. Like we were saying, this is most likely right after the time period that Nebuchadnezzar had taken out Carchemish and is now returning to Jerusalem because Jehoiakim has decided to rebel and is about to take out the next group of exiles. Remember, in our first timeline, we looked at there are 3 groups of exiles that we had, and we're going to the second. Daniel and his friends were in the first one, and then we're going into the second one here, or is about to happen. Some people may wonder, and you guys may wonder the same thing because the way you guys think is that in chapter 1, verse 1, we're in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar. But now we're in the 2nd year of his reign. Any thoughts about why we would either go back a year, or is there some sort of confusion about what's going on for the writers at this point? Because we had 3rd year, now we're in 2nd year.
That is a good question.
Sometimes to think about.
Yeah.
So the easy debate is that the people who edited this and over time made a mistake. That's some commentaries will say.
He addresses Meshach and Abednego.
Yeah.
In the 2nd year, and he named them in the 1st year.
But it started in the 3rd year. Chapter 1.
But the first one is where they got their names, and then he addresses them in this chapter by those names.
And in the 3rd
Well,
year,
in the
he
3rd
was still
chapter.
calling them Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
That's my point.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he's reintroduced to Daniel here in chapter 2, which is interesting as well.
Could have been a dyslexic scribe.
It could have been. It could have been. Others would take, and I think this is probably one of the more popular opinions, is that this could be the 2nd year that Nebuchadnezzar had full control over Judah at this point. I mean, this is the 2nd year in, and that could be, that's just another take. Another option that people have brought into trying to interpret why it would say in the 2nd year of his reign, as in his 2nd year of his reign over Judah at this point. Because initially when he attacked Judah, he was going to kind of make them a vassal state that paid tribute to them, and he was going to just take some of their ruling class and be done with it. But since they're rebelling against him and not paying tribute, because remember, Jehoiakim tried to ally with the Egyptians and saying, hey, if we team up together, we can take out Babylon. The Egyptians, of course, what we know is that they backed out and said, no, we're not going to do that. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes them out. So anyways, just some things to think about the 2 years.
Could it be because the flow of things, the first chapter introduces the people, Daniel and his companions, and how they are loyal to God. And then we get into this next chapter, which kind of knowing that how the 4 of them are, then it just proceeds on. It seems like it fits better that way.
Okay, that's what you're saying.
Then starting with the 2nd chapter, they come back and introducing the people, you reverse these chapters.
Sure.
And then what happened to the 1st year?
No, that's not the way I read it.
I'm just, that's a take. Go ahead. What's your take on
But
it?
it says on the 1st chapter, they're talking about the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. So it's Jehoiakim's 3rd year.
Yeah.
But in the next chapter, they're talking about the 2nd year in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So Jehoiakim was already in power, and then a year later comes Nebuchadnezzar, and that was his second year, but it would have actually been Jehoiakim's third year, maybe?
Possibly. So let's see here. If I have it here. So Nebuchadnezzar comes. Yeah. So Nabopolassar, sorry, I can't say that one right. Polassar's son Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt and Assyria in the Battle of Carchemish in 605. Becomes Nebuchadnezzar II, becomes king in 605. He defeats Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and Jehoiakim becomes his vassal in 605. And then in 601, Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's failed invasion of Egypt. Does that shine any light on that for you guys? About how that could work out?
I think you're wrong.
Yeah, I can't see from there, but Jehoiakim was.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to make it so big, much bigger.
But Jehoiakim was king longer than
Mm-hmm.
Nebuchadnezzar. He was
Yeah.
king first.
Well,
No, he wasn't. He was only king 11 years.
yeah.
Well, I mean,
Jehoiakim
but it was he became a king
before.
before
Correct.
Nebuchadnezzar
Yeah.
became a king.
Mhm.
Right.
He did. And then there is debate here in this time period if the authors who wrote this, who claimed Jehoiakim may have been Jehoiakim, his son, because
Okay.
of some sort of more people would understand who Jehoiakim was more than Jehoiakim. That's another way to look at it as well. But yeah, there's a lot to it. But I see your point as well about how that could be played out too. We briefly talked about before we even started actually what the dreams was. The dreams that he was having, like I said, some people would look at that as a trance. Maybe he had multiple dreams over a period of time. Either way, it had caused a level of insomnia or unable to sleep. He was extremely disturbed and suffered by this.
When you dream,
Mhm.
and maybe this isn't relevant, do you dream in real time? I mean, my point is, he could have this huge dream that he was gifted with. Like, could that happen in a 10-minute period? I mean, can you have a long,
Yeah, where it
you're
feels
not-
like it's a long
It's supposed
time.
to
Yeah,
happen it all the
uh-huh.
time, because
Yeah,
obviously you don't live it in real time, but,
right. Yeah.
How long do you have to be asleep to have a dream of significance?
Well, I think that's really interesting because
I don't know. Yeah, that's true.
he only had 24 hours, him and his buddies, to figure out what the dream was.
Mm-hmm.
So he had less than 24 hours to figure out what
Yeah,
the dream was.
so it's just,
That was
bingo.
real time.
I
Yeah.
don't dream that complicated either. I mean, all those different layers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was so complicated. I can see why he was very confused and
Yeah.
stuff. You know.
But it also says he had dreams, plural. And
Yeah.
it could have
Okay.
been the same dream over and over, and that's what's
Okay.
causing him his
Right.
restless. It
Right.
doesn't
Yeah.
say
It
he's
wasn't going
having
to go away.
different. If you dream the same thing a week straight, you had dreams.
Right.
Period.
Mhm.
You
Do you
know?
remember last week we talked about dreams could symbolize that it's going to happen, that there's a
It's
Like a
prophecy.
harbinger
prophecy,
or
maybe a
omen.
prophecy, or that it's something that's going to happen because it's referred to as dreams versus a dream. But I think there's other ways to look at it too, that this was happening over a period of time. And it could have been, obviously it was very disturbing. And another question you can probably think about through here is if God is sovereign, which we know he is he allowing the dream to happen for Nebuchadnezzar? But then as we dig deeper into it, the king doesn't remember what his dream is. So we have to figure out how that works out. But what's interesting is we go into verse 2 here in chapter 2. A decree or an order is called to call in all your magicians, astrologers, channers, charmers, Chaldeans, exorcists, you name it, they brought it in. Some would say the author is mocking the ability of these people because he knows that they are just earthly people with earthly abilities. Though there are times, if you look back in the time of Pharaoh and his magicians, they were able to do things that would be considered to be supernatural. It doesn't seem like that's the case here with these people. Maybe at some point along the way they're able to, but At this point, I think the author is making a point that there's a powerful God that is about to give Daniel the information and the answer, and all of these other advisors of Nebuchadnezzar's. I mean, you see the list of them here. You can imagine it doesn't give you a number, but there's a lot, hundreds maybe, of these advisors who come in and they spend their time. So it's kind of like they have their books, they have their diagrams, they have their scrolls, all their resources that if Nebuchadnezzar tells them what their dream is, because they'll ask here in a second, if they tell him what that dream is, they'll be able to look at their book from the past and say, okay, based on what you just said, this is what this symbolizes and this is what your dream was about. But God doesn't allow it to work that way, which is, I think, of course, part of the fascinating side of this. So just to kind of give you an idea about who some of these guys are. So who has diviners as one of your people? Anyone have diviners as an option? It depends on what translation you're looking at. You have enchanters?
I have enchanters.
Yeah.
Okay. Enchanters were
Sorcerer would be a diviner for me.
it could be. They were mainly priests and magicians, the diviners were.
Enchanters. Yeah, I have magicians too.
Yeah, and it really just, again, it depends on your translation on what that could be. So the diviners were called to interpret and help provide guidance on how the king should avoid any sort of danger or peril from his dream.
Well, he identifies all those, and he says, and the
Yep.
Chaldeans or
The Chaldeans,
Chaldeans.
yep,
Yeah, that's a people group.
that they were a people group.
That apparently had some kind of
Yeah, not
foretelling.
yeah.
ability.
They were able to. They're not necessarily a supernatural power, but they did have some abilities to be able to see in the future. They would translate what they refer to as cuneiform, which is of course an ancient style of writing, and then from that be able to tell you what the dream was about, or be able to tell you what the future could look like. So that's what the Chaldeans would be like. They were probably a lot like astrologers. They probably were astrologists during that time, or astrologers. Then you had the exorcists who looked at animal parts. They look at like a cow liver, and from that cow liver could determine what it is that could possibly be that is happening as part of the interpretation of the dream. Who else did you have? You had the charmers who did the magic spells or said charms, had charms. Let's see. So there's quite a group. And the reason I think this is significant, of course, is because you have all these people here who are supposed to be the wisest of the kingdom. They're supposed to be the king's advisors, so they're supposed to be extremely well-read, very wise, and be able to do pretty much interpret anything that the king comes to them with, but they cannot do anything. And as we see
He's
that,
not going to tell him what
you wonder about that. Is he? So you gotta think: is he not telling us, and he knows because he wants to know if we're real or not, or does he really not know when he doesn't want to act like he? I mean, it's really interesting because he's playing. It's true mind games that's going on here. What's going? I mean, I would hate to be the one of the guys and say, "Oh yeah, this is what it's about," and the king's like, "Well,
Yeah, that'd be
you're
wrong.
no,
Well,
off their
well,
head."
yeah.
Not.
Yeah, which the thing is, and you have to think Daniel even, he has that faith in God as we go into this, but at the same time, what he's doing is extremely, extremely risky. So as we continue on here, now
Can I ask you a question?
yes, sir.
Of the people that were the astrologers and that, which of this group was the Magi?
Chaldeans are in the east. Whatever that means.
Yeah, I don't know.
If you look at that map, the Chaldeans are way over,
Yeah, they're right here.
way over there.
Here's where Abram was, by the way. I don't know. I don't know who
The Magi
was.
apparently came from the east.
I know it was a mix, but I don't know exactly if they were who they were, what their superpower was.
Well, the Magi in that country, in Babylon,
Yeah.
they were the ones that perpetuated the kingdom. They were the ones that chose the next king.
Yeah. Right.
And that's, of course, where we get the word magistrate from.
Mm-hmm.
And brings me back to the birth of the Lord when the Magi showed up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
why they were afraid of him, afraid of the Magi. Well, the Magi were the ruling people in Babylon who selected the king. So if they, I mean, they came in the name of Babylon. They didn't come, just 3 of them.
Right, and they came from that area.
Right, I knew that's,
Yeah.
Of the country.
The whole group came. I mean, he had
It's
an
a big
army
group.
behind him there.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is some incorrect interpretation. I think there were only 3 people. Is a large
But this is
group.
the Magi. I don't know. I couldn't figure that out from this group of people here.
I couldn't either. So I haven't.
So you get later on
Yeah.
when they get accused and thrown into the furnace, which we'll get to. And
Yeah.
there was a different.
Yeah. No, I don't know. But still, that'd be quite a walk for where they ended up. You want to do that for homework next week?
Yeah.
All right, let's continue on.
Get you to ask questions.
Oh, no. Yeah. Verse 5. The king replied to the wise men, "My decision is firm. If you do not inform me of both the dream and its interpretation, you will be dismembered or killed." Or dismembered is always a nice thing to think about.
Yeah.
As in your limbs will be torn off. And your homes reduced to rubble. As in not only killing you, but also my understanding of this, also killing your family and extended family for the most part. And of course, destroying your physical home. But if you can disclose the dreams and its interpretation, you'll receive from me gifts, a reward, and considerable honor. So disclose to me the dream and its interpretation. So they're going to reply here in a minute. But what is this? The king just says, what does it kind of tell you about his personality?
So do you think he knew what the dream was and he's trying to get them to say it? Or did he
Hard to
really
tell.
That's what we were just.
get it?
Yeah.
I just don't know.
It's one of those things like, do you know? And you're going to trick us? And then when we say the wrong thing, you're going to kill us anyways?
Mm-hmm.
Or he really didn't know because he was so crazy and so anxious and so many things going on right now. He really did forget. It's hard
But
to.
Daniel told him the dream, and he was okay with that. So he had to know about the figure. He didn't know what the figure meant.
I don't know. Yeah, well, yeah, I know, but
He knew the dream. I think he was just testing.
You think he was
their
just testing them?
credibility. You know, these guys, shamans go around, they say all kinds of, you tell them something and they'll tell you, they always told you something.
yeah, it's almost like he doesn't trust them.
Yeah.
Of who they are. I could see that too. Yeah.
It seems like, no, go ahead.
It's like you said, they looked stuff up in books, so if he gave them the words, they were just looking it up in the dictionary. So rather than giving them the words,
Yeah.
he was saying, you tell me what the words are.
Right.
Let me see, anybody can look something up in a dictionary.
Right.
But could he see all the different properties that thing was made of? You know what I mean?
So
Did he
I don't know.
understand it? I mean,
He maybe
this
didn't
is
see it
different
clearly.
from this, or was
Yeah.
it, or but how was it different? You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think he saw it clearly, which is part of it. And I think he was. Well, you got to just think the guy was nuts. At the end of the day, I mean, really think about how he responded to people, and he's pretty much going to say, "If you don't give me the right answer, I'm going to kill you." And then pretty much the next thing that comes out of his mouth, if you do figure it out, you're going to be extremely, well rewarded with extravagant gifts and considerable honor. And eventually, what does he do for Daniel? Later on, Daniel is now looking over the entire kingdom. So the guy's just all over the place, and so who knows? It's really kind of hard to interpret his psychology of what's going on there. And you can tell as you go into verse 7. The reply that you get from the people. So they again replied, "Let the king inform us, or inform his servants of the dream, then we will disclose its interpretation." Yeah. Well, that's kind of the easy way out, right? So why do you think the author has a reason to do this? Because you have to think, who were the first people to read this? It certainly wasn't us. It was people who were in the diaspora or in the exile at the time were reading this. And if we remember from the first week, one thing that when people were reading this, especially during the time of the Greek and Roman occupation of the people of Jerusalem or Judah, they were looking back at this as Daniel was the hero who was able to survive Nebuchadnezzar and actually outwit Nebuchadnezzar. And so think about what is it that these first-time readers or even second or third generation readers are seeing from this? What are they seeing being contrasted here between what the king's advisors can do versus what they cannot do, and then eventually, as we go in here, what Daniel is able to do. You don't have to necessarily answer that, but think about that as we go through this. Is if you were there in the 5th century, how would you be reading this versus now? I think one thing that you see from here is a message of eventual hope. And what we'll see from this statue is we'll see that, and we talked about last week as well, is that the Babylonian rule, this extreme, powerful, oppressive rule, is going to end soon, leading to eventually a peace and prosperity. So just some things to think about right there.
Well, it was written, it was written, you said, starting from verse 4,
Mhm.
Aramaic.
Mhm.
So if it was just the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, I mean, would all of the Jewish people been, not the word acclimated, but, would they be speaking Aramaic instead of, well, would they be bilingual at this point?
Well, I think there's probably other things. Well, we know that they try to indoctrinate them, and we talked about this last week
Right.
about the indoctrination from the ruling class down.
But those are the ruling class.
Right, but
Yeah.
eventually coming down to everyone, as in everyone will now be indoctrinated into Babylonian viewpoints. I don't know. I couldn't answer that question on that because it's.
Well, you were asking
Yeah.
who was this written for back then.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking if it's in Aramaic, then you would assume that the Jewish people would be speaking, both languaes.
And they did. Actually, Hebrew and Aramaic was within the realm of that people group, anyways. So it wouldn't have been too far of a stretch for them to be able to understand Aramaic at that point. It's an older language than Hebrew.
Well, it kind of
So they probably-
confirms what we were talking about before too. They traditionally you told the sayer or the whoever you're talking to what your dream was, and then it's like going to a fortune teller.
Right.
If you tell them, they'll be right there with an answer.
Right.
And so maybe they had some suspicion.
Yeah.
Or he
Or
did.
reading the tea leaves.
That's what they were doing, and then he kind of told them where it was.
Yeah. Let's continue. The king replied, "I know for sure that you are attempting to gain time because you see that my decision is firm." So obviously here the king does not trust
Yeah.
the advisors by any stretch. He thinks they're trying to manipulate him too, and I would assume he probably thought there's a continual conspiracy against him as well. And you'd think people like that probably did think such a thing, that
Yeah.
someone was always trying to conspire to take him out. If you don't inform me of the dream, there is only one thing that is going to happen to you, for you have agreed among yourselves to report to me something false and deceitful until such a time as things might change. So you're kind of just wasting time here. So tell me the dream, and I will have confidence that you can disclose its interpretation, so that he will know that you can disclose its interpretation. So obviously there's a trust issue between him and his advisors, which never leads to a healthy kingdom. It's kind of toxic if you really look at it. You can imagine an organization run this way would not last very long or do very well. And so that's what we see going on here. And again, it's one of those things that we were talking about earlier, is the king bluffing or not? And these guys have to figure that out. And if they don't, they'll be dead, because they either lied, or they're making something up, or they're trying to deceive the king. There's really not a win for them at this point that I can see as we go through this. That's part of it.
Except the last sentence there.
What's that?
Well, I don't know if you got it down there Friday night.
No, we're just at 9.
Oh. 11.
Come on, Bob. We're getting there.
Never read
I know. No. So this is foreign territory for these advisors. They've never been asked to tell them a dream, just to interpret one. So again, foreign ground that they're trying to tread, and they know that any mistake, they're going to die, and their families will be taken on too. And we go into 10. The wise men replied to the king, "There is no man on earth who is able to disclose the king's secret. For no king, regardless of his position and power, has ever requested such a thing from any magician, astrologer, or wise man. What the king is asking is too difficult, and no one exists who can disclose it to the king except for the gods, but they don't live among mortals." So what's your point on there?
The last.
Yeah, on verse 11?
He's basically saying if we can do that, it would come from God.
Right. So they believed, so the Babylonian advisors and priests believed that their gods were very distant and aloof. You have to remember, from their creation myth, the reason people were created in the first place according to gods was to handle all the kind of the stuff the lower gods didn't want to do, such as dig trenches and build things and haul dirt and haul water. They didn't, and the gods found, of course, the people to be annoying, and so the gods stayed away from the people for the most part. Is kind of what you're seeing here, as in they don't live among the mortals, or they're not able for us to access. But the thing is that the author is doing this on purpose. He is setting up Daniel, and he's setting up the Jewish God to be complete different contrast to what these pagan gods are, and to what the kings believe, and what the king and the advisors believe. So no king, and so remember, the king Nebuchadnezzar thought himself to be divine. So no king can even figure this out. Even a divine king like you, Nebuchadnezzar, can figure this out. None of us advisors, magicians, astrologers, or wise men can figure this out. And only the gods can, but they aren't even going to talk to us because they are not even amongst us. So they're in a really big bind here. So what we're seeing, again, like I said, is a contrast of what their lack of faith in their gods, contrasted with what we're about to read about the extreme amount of faith that Daniel has in his God. And so as we continue on into 12, because of this, the king got furiously angry and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So a decree went out, and the wise men were about to be executed. You may have a little bit different translation there. Does anyone have a little bit different there in 13? Because there's some debate about that. About to be killed, about to be executed. About to be slain. I was reading earlier a little bit more about this. Execution.
And they loved Daniel and his buddies in that group.
Well, you kind of wonder, was Daniel around while this was all going on? Because he was part of that advisor group at this point. So you kind of wonder if he was he in? Not that he was advising, but you don't think he was in it? Yeah. Okay. I've seen that argument. I've seen other arguments too.
It was his boss who recommended he go interpret the dreams.
He would have known that.
You don't think he was in the big court?
Because as you read on, they come to look for him to kill him, and he's like,
well, maybe he took
"Don't
off.
kill me."
Yeah.
It says that they sought Daniel's to kill him.
So the idea of we're about to be, some have taken the original Hebrew of we're about to be to actually not to be about to be, but it was actually happening in the present moment. And that was based on the grammatical tense of the Hebrew word. But I like to think they were about to be, but again, people like to debate about different Hebrew words in certain ways. But anyways, they also sought Daniel and his friends so that they could be executed. So thinking of this, of course, Daniel was then put up, remember they were set up as high advisors at this point, or high level advisors at this point. And so they were being looked at as well. Daniel spoke with prudent counsel to Arioch, who was in charge of the king's executioners, who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. He inquired of Arioch, the king's deputy, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested the king to grant him that he might disclose the interpretation to the king. So what a little bit different here is how Daniel approaches the king there in verse 16. So when Daniel goes in and requests the king to grant him time, what does he do that what does he not do that the other advisors did when they first responded to the king? Which is a huge faux pas. And it's surprising that Nebuchadnezzar didn't respond to this in a negative way.
Well, the other advisors said no man can do this.
Go further back.
Nobody.
Go further back. When they were first addressing the king, how did they?
Say, may the king live forever.
May the king live forever. So when you walked into the king's court, you were supposed to bow to the king and say, "May the king live forever." He walks in and says, "Hey, I just need some more time." And so there's this kind of the exile the Judean exile who now has the upper hand on the Babylonian king who's supposed to be the guy in power. And so it's almost like there's a little bit of a power switch
remember
at this
that-
point. Yep.
that Nebuchadnezzar said, or he determined from when they did their oral exams that they were 10 times
Mhm.
sharper than the rest of the advisors.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you think
So-
that's why he didn't have to? He maybe had a different relationship
Well,
with
I
him.
think, yeah, that's exactly what.
Okay. Okay. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I just wonder, you still wonder when you see, like reading books and seeing shows, when someone approaches a king, no matter their level, even the queen, when she approaches a king, always something is said. So I think sometimes people, what's that?
Subjugation.
Subjugation and
Yeah.
protocol.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just wonder if he's kind of stepping around that and just,
I got another take on that.
yeah, go ahead.
The other guys wanted a hint from Nebuchadnezzar, the king.
Yeah.
What was your dream about now? Can you tell us? And then we'll interpret it. He didn't ask him that.
Uh-uh.
He didn't ask him, give me a hint there, king.
Right.
He just said, just give me time and I'll tell you.
Yeah. So, because what is that telling you about Daniel? What's his angle?
You had faith you know the answer.
He had
He
faith
wasn't
that
afraid.
God would provide that. Yeah, because
He
knew
had
that
faith in God, yeah.
And that God was with him. And that's the thing with this is throughout this entire story of Daniel, the entire book, God is, even though you don't see God's hand all the way through it, He is guiding the entire thing. And God is with them. And that is another thing that the exiles who are reading this or heard it, most likely they heard it versus reading it because most of them couldn't read. When they heard this story, they knew that that God was with them, and that even though it was an oppressive regime that was over them, God was with them and eventually would save them. So Daniel, like verse 16, Daniel goes in and requests that time. Then Daniel went, in verse 70, Daniel went to his home and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And notice that they're using what names here?
They're Hebrew names.
They're Hebrew names, right? Again, this shows the power of the Hebrew God over the power of the pagan gods is what you're kind of seeing a contrast here, the living God. So we're going back to the Jewish names.
Well, Daniel had one advantage over the others because when the others approached the king, they had no idea what they were walking into. But Daniel had the opportunity to talk to the guard
Yep.
and found out what happened. So he knew what he was walking into.
Well, yeah, that's a
So
good
he
point.
had time
Yeah.
to kind of
Yeah.
prepare his defense.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. At least he
to
knew.
set up his position because he knew
Yeah.
what he was going to.
He knew what
Obviously,
Nebuchadnezzar would be
Daniel
mad.
had rapport too, because the best way, not that I've ever done this, but usually surprise is the best way if you want to off someone. You don't just walk in and say, "Hi, I'm here to kill you."
Right.
You know, that's a lot harder to do it that way
Yeah.
than just walk in, and just whack.
Right.
You
But he
know.
hadn't yet killed the others.
Right.
He was
He
sent.
just wanted
He
to
was
get 'em
sent
all
to
in
kill him. It says he was sent to kill
him.
him.
And
No.
Daniel
Well, I
knew
think
that.
he
The
probably
others didn't
sent
know
to
that was
round them
coming.
up and throw them
Like,
into the lion's
Not the
den.
Or-
droid
or the
you're looking
furnace, yeah.
for.
So when they first went to the king, they
Because
were
the
all
others are
happy
still
and
alive.
like, okay,
Right.
we're here with the king. And
Right.
Daniel's
Or
going,
maybe
"Whoa,
some
this is a
died.
big
He says,
deal.
"Don't
Better
kill
watch
the
my
rest."
step."
It just says
Yeah.
others. It doesn't say
I think
all
so.
of them.
I think so. Yeah. There's a. Yeah. So, as we said, let's see here. Let's keep on going. 17. Actually, make sure. Should I skip anything? No, this is going to be in verse 18. Okay. So he goes and talks to his three friends, and he asked them to pray for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. So the mystery here is what's the important key word here. So that he and his friends, or maybe you may have Daniel, so that so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed along with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So they were. How do you read that end of verse 18? Do you think it's the other guys are still going to get killed, besides Daniel and his 4 friends? Or he is saving, based on being able to do this, he's saving not only himself and his 3 friends, but he's also saving all the wise men of Babylon.
Yes, I think he sent out to round up Daniel and his 3 friends.
Okay.
To come in with the others, and then they're going to kill them all. He said so he could be with the rest of them.
Right, but do you think what's Daniel's intent here at the end of 18? I read it.
Asking them to pray for revelation.
He's praying for revelation, but is he trying to save himself and his Judean friends, or is he trying to save everyone?
I think everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
He thinks if
All
he
right.
can come up with the
Mhm.
answer,
Yep.
I won't want to be killed with
None
the
of the-
rest of these guys. They won't be killed either.
No. Okay. None of the advisors will be killed. No one dies at this moment.
Well, to the glory of God.
To the glory of God. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because it's God's. Absolutely. So the mystery. Why is that important? What is if you're just because you're curious? The word is raz in R-A-Z is how it's spelled. Well, our English version of it, but for mystery. Why is that important concerning this mystery? You only see it here, and you'll see it brought up a little bit later on by Nebuchadnezzar. Not calling it a dream, but it's a mystery.
Well, in my study Bible, it refers, it has that italicized, but it's referring back to the God of heaven.
Okay.
And it then says to reference Ezra chapter 1, verse 2, where it talks about the God of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And that says this is a key word in Daniel. It shows up in a number of verses and chapters across Daniel. So it's the mystery, according to this, is referencing why did he call them the God of heaven.
Okay, so I can see that to a point of the God of heaven can only do what? Is I think where you're going with, is where this is
Well,
going.
it says instead of calling him Yahweh,
Yep.
he called him the God of heaven, the God of Israel.
He
Right.
said he blessed the God of heaven, and mine says that.
Right, but the God of Israel can what? He's the only one who can provide the knowledge and the wisdom to interpret the dream. Is where this is going. The mystery can only be
Right.
I think
interpreted. Go ahead.
it's a matter of perspective.
Mhm.
To Nebuchadnezzar, it was dreams. But to Daniel, who had a relationship with God, it was a mystery.
Or
Okay.
an
So
opportunity.
that, because that was Daniel's thoughts, was this is a mystery.
Or
I-
prophecy.
I think it's an opportunity.
Yeah, no, it is an opportunity. I agree. But I think that the point that is trying to be made here is that this is humanity only is revealed so much, and only God can reveal it. And God is revealing something that no one else can know, because not even it's up for debate. Not even the king knows what it was. It's trying to be interpreted here, and so it's showing that you have a God, the one and only God, who has the ability to do this.
Okay,
versus-
listen to this. It
Yeah.
kind of corresponds to what you're saying. I'll
Okay.
read this here. It won't take long. Chapter 2:18, God of heaven. In this chapter, this Persian title for a high God is used to refer to Yahweh, the God of Israel, mystery.
Mhm.
A key word. Okay, it also appears often in writings, the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran, which you and I saw that, sect, The Greek equivalent is used in the New Testament to refer to the secret purposes of God that he reveals only to his chosen prophets and apostles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're saying so.
what
To me, I look at that as the dream is the tactic in which he's using. The mystery is the why behind and the purpose behind it that God only knows.
that only God can provide.
That God can provide.
That knowledge. Yeah.
Anybody can talk about a dream,
Yeah.
but nobody can really talk about the purpose behind the dream. Because God's the only one that can reveal that.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. I think we're all going in the same direction there. Something to think about, this mystery that we're going to be interpreting with Daniel here in a minute. Sometimes when you see mystery and the idea of this knowledge that God's providing, sometimes you look well off into the future, as in a eschatological view of what the world will look like when Jerusalem all comes back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is new and there's peace and prosperity. Other people have looked at this mystery as what it will be when Babylon is no longer in power. Some are looking at kind of a more of a messianic viewpoint of when Jesus comes for the first time. So there's a few ways we'll be looking at that as we move forward with it. But the idea that what the future could look like is part of that. So as we go on here into we've done verse 18, and then go into 19. So then in the night vision, so Daniel now has a vision. Then in the night vision, the mystery was revealed to Daniel. So Daniel praised the God of heaven. And so we get a poem or a song, depending on how you want to look at that. So through this night vision, Daniel understands the mystery that only God can reveal. And he does this wonderful prayer or praise song to God that says, let the name of God be praised forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. He changes times and seasons, disposing some kings and establishing others. He gives wisdom to the wise. He imparts knowledge to those with understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light resides with him. O God of my fathers, I acknowledge and glorify you, for you have bestowed wisdom and power on me. Now you have enabled me to understand what I requested from you, for you have enabled me to understand the king's dilemma. I would assume that's how we all pray on a regular basis, right? That's sort of really poetic prayers, yes.
Listen to me last night.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's just beautiful. Very well said, spoken, Daniel. Thank you. You've got to think. This is of course, a prayer of blessing, and God is. We kind of get a Genesis creation vibe to this, of God being the ultimate creator. Again, the entire prayer, if you look at it and you compare it to the Babylonians, and you compare it to the way their advisors worked or their faith in their own gods, it completely contrasts with how they think of their gods versus how Daniel thinks of his God. He brings in the patriarchs there in 23 of this, related to a God of my fathers, and all the wisdom that he has provided to him throughout this time. One way to another thing to think about this, we have to remember that during the time of the diaspora, or even we'll just stick with the exile at this point, the temple was gone. It had been, for the most part, destroyed. They had no access to it. Even if it had not been destroyed completely yet, they had no access to it. What the people of Judah during the time of diaspora realized is that their God is still with them. But when they went to the temple, they would think that God, of course, resides in the temple. That's what they believed, and the priest would go in and sacrifice and everything. But now that they don't have a temple, you got to think it's pretty hard on them to kind of realize, how do I connect with God? But you're able to see prayers like this, and so the people who hear this or read this in later generations will see that, oh wow, this God who we thought we could only meet in the temple is with us all the time, and we can pray to him. We can have these powerful prayers, and he still imparts knowledge, and he still imparts wisdom, and he still is here with us. So it helps them to be able to link the God. So you have to remember, they're always trying to remember and keep in mind who they are. The God of creation, the God they knew when they were a powerful nation from their past, and the God that they still know who was the God of creation and the God that has kept them and made the covenants with them. It is the same God. And so a prayer like this helps them remember, which is why we sing, why we like to read the Psalms, why we continue to reference the Scripture, why we continue to pray. We do it for the same reason, to help us remember that is our God. It is the same God that was been forever and will continue on forever. And that helps them do that as well. Does that kind of make sense for that part of it? What he's trying to do here, what the author is trying to do back in that time period? All right. Then Daniel went in to see, verse 24, to see Arioch. Of course, remember, he's a chief executioner, or the commander of executioners, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He came and said to him, "Don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Escort me to the king, and I will disclose the interpretation to him." So the interpretation, or the knowledge and wisdom received by God to Daniel, he will now tell the king. So Arioch quickly ushered Daniel into the king's presence. You've got to think, Arioch probably didn't want to go off and kill hundreds of people at this point. Though he probably had to at one point in his life, he probably didn't want to this time, just based on how this is being worded. Quickly ushered Daniel into the king's presence, saying to him, "I have found a man from the captives of Judah who can make known the interpretation to the king." Is this odd? Think about what he says.
Yeah, because Daniel had just seen him the night before.
Seemingly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that weird? And now he's getting reintroduced. So you kind of wonder, why is this happening that way? It just, I mean, there's ideas. There's like, this is maybe inserted later. There's parts, edited over time.
Maybe he's trying to pop himself up. He goes, "I have
Look who I found. I have brought in the guy who's going to answer answer your dreams and everything you ever thought." Because earlier on, as you reference back, Arioch told Daniel about what was going on, but it doesn't seem like Arioch went in with Daniel to the king there in 15 and 16. Here he takes Daniel in. But then look at 26. The king then asked Daniel, whose name was also Belteshazzar. So again, we're not using his Babylonian name. And that is symbolic of him still being fully and truly Hebrew, or fully being a true Jew, or one from Judah. "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I saw, as well as its interpretation?" Daniel replied to the king, "The mystery that the king is asking about is such that no wise men, astrologers, magicians, or diviners can possibly disclose it to the king. But, either way, there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the times to come." Why would he say it that way? And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen. The dream and the visions you had while lying on your bed are as follows.
Well, what he's been doing is assessing the king's dream
Mm-hmm.
to God.
Right.
God's made you know of that.
God.
Now I'm going to tell you what it's about.
God has given me
But it's a
the
God-given
The
dream.
singular source of this, what I'm getting ready to tell you, could only come from God.
right, and God is gracious enough to allow you to know too. Is that because he's saying has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar. But anyways,
He's actually elevating Nebuchadnezzar by telling him that God came to you.
Exactly.
You were God's
Exactly.
choice to reveal
Yep.
this to.
yeah, I think that's
I'm here
a
to
closer
serve
way to
you.
look at it. Yeah, Daniel's just the mouthpiece of what God is
Yeah.
trying to say. So he's like a prophet.
Kind of buttering him
Yeah,
up.
so you're higher than me because God came to you.
Yeah, he's giving you this information. I'm just the
Backdoor
person.
evangelizing.
Oh, sure.
Notice that the king asked for the dream,
Uh-huh.
and Daniel's response was, "I'll give you the mystery."
Yeah, that's good point.
Yeah.
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 It's more than just the dream, it's
Amen.
what happens.
Why do you think that is? What's the difference?
Well,
Just
it's
based
kind
on
of like
what
what
we
you talked about a while ago.
Yeah, yeah.
It's God's revelation
Right.
of a greater picture, what's going to happen.
Versus just some facts of what my
Yeah.
dream is about. This is a bigger, absolutely, a bigger revelation. Absolutely, I think that's a good way to look at that. Whenever you see, where'd it go? You may have latter days or later days there in the middle of 228. What will happen in times to come? Latter days, later days. Again, this is where there's that debate about is this the end of the Babylonian rule? Is this the end of the time that the Roman rule, which is the fourth piece of metal that we'll see there on the statue? Is this eschatological? Is this well into the future? So again, there's a debate there. And at the end of the day, we'll talk more about that when we get there.
It's a God-given prophecy, is what he's telling you.
Yeah.
And
Right.
So that reinforces the fact that it's a God-inspired dream. It's prophetic also.
It is, and it's pointing to prophetic but prophetic, remember, doesn't always have to be distant future. It can be, so you remember Jeremiah said the exile with the Babylonians is going to be 70 years.
Yeah.
He may be talking about what's going to happen after the 70 years. Because it's going to be better under the Persians than it was under the Babylonians. So maybe there's the sense of hope that that's going to happen. Or maybe it is a further sense. Either way, he's providing a sense of hope here. As for you, O king, while you were in your bed, your thoughts turned to future things. The revealer of mysteries has made known to you what will take place. As for me, this mystery was revealed to me not because I possess more wisdom than any other living person, but so that the king may understand the interpretation and comprehend the thoughts of your mind. Isn't Daniel so humble when he says that? You got to think of, he's a lot like Joseph, the way Joseph, when he interpreted dreams later on in life, not when he first did it, he was a little arrogant, but later on when he was working with the Pharaoh, he would come across as a whole lot more humble. That it was Daniel does not take credit for this information or for this revelation. Joseph didn't take credit for the revelation. It's all going back to God. So similar sort of way that they are doing that in the revelation of this mystery. Also, the reason some people would say that he comes at this angle, and you guys probably are seeing this as well, is that he's kind of this self-advocating viewpoint of he doesn't want to sound like he's even more powerful than the king, or that he's better than the king. The king is still the king, and he is just the provider of information here.
In the business world, it's when you give a presentation that everybody's congratulating you, and you're saying, "No, I owe it all to."
Oh, no.
No. He's the one that taught me everything to do.
I just push the button on the slides.
That is kind of butter, kind of not discounting the fact that you have knowledge. It's not arrogantly talking down to somebody.
Right.
It's actually buttering them up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Setting them up. Yep. You, O king, were watching as a great statue, one of impressive. I'm going to read the rest of this through 36, and we'll talk about it. Of impressive size and extraordinary brightness was standing before you. Its appearance caused alarm. I think I read it was 60 cubits is what they try to measure.
60 by 6.
Is that what it was? 60 by 6, wasn't it? Yeah. Cubits are 16 inches. A cubit is a 16 inch? Yeah. So you got to just imagine how tall that was. As for that statue, its head was of fine gold, its chest and arms were of silver, its belly and thighs were of bronze, its legs were of iron, its feet were partly of iron and partly of clay. You were watching as a stone was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its iron and clay feet, breaking them in pieces. And the iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold were broken into pieces without distinction. It became like chaff from the summer threshing floors that the wind carries away. When there is probably more spirit, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Not a trace of them could be found, but the stone that struck the statue became a large mountain that filled the entire earth. This was the dream. Now we will set forth before the king its interpretation. So as you can see here, when you go to the next section here, there's no disagreement from the king here. Daniel just kind of will jump into the interpretation. But there's a lot going on here with it regarding, first of all, of course, it's a huge statue, extremely powerful The Assyrians, the Persians, the Babylonians were known for their huge statues, very powerful, impressive, extraordinary sized statues. So this would not be a surprise to anyone that this would, of course, be something of impressive stature and size. This idea of having 4 metals was pretty common in Persian literature during this time. If I can say this right, a common source that they usually refer to as the Bama Yashat, which is kind of how they would use different stories using 4 elements, such as the 4 metals here. I believe the Persians had their own kind of version of this, where it was 4 branches of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Similar sort of stories here. What this allows for is that people have a point of reference of what they're trying to talk about here, because the Persians would have a similar sort of point and idea. Anything like gold and silver is majestic and precious type metals. The bronze and iron are things of war and battle, and the people of Israel or the people of Judah would completely understand that. If you remember, when David went into battles, he would go up against people with iron chariots, and they didn't have the right equipment to go up against them. They were very familiar with that sort of iron power and iron ability, and the idea is that most likely being Rome, but I don't want to get too far ahead into that point here. But we have this kind of breakdown of who this king is. Before we get a little bit deeper into it, there's also and we'll talk based on our timing right now. We'll have to talk about this next time we meet. But there's conversation about, are the 4 metals representing the 4 kings of Babylon, from Nebuchadnezzar to the next 3, or is it representing like the heads of the 4 beasts that we'll see later on in Daniel, where it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome? Something that we will talk about. And if you guys wanted to kind of think about that ahead of time, I would encourage you to do so, because there's a lot of conversation about, is it just the kings that he's talking about here, the Babylonian kings, or is it other nations that he's talking about? And there's good arguments on both sides of that. The word here for stone, in Hebrew it's eben, E-B-E-N. And what that typically would mean is, it's rock or stone, but they've also used it in other parts of Scripture to reference God. So the idea being that it's something created by God coming down to destroy this statue that you see here there in verse 34. So, of course, not made by human hands, most likely pointing to a divine stone or a rock created by a divine being, most likely God. Whenever you see clay, what does that mean? So iron mixed with clay. What does that kind of give you about iron? It's not
soft.
It's soft, right? So it's going to be easy to.
It weakens it.
Yeah, iron is very strong, but it also shows that with it mixed with the clay,
It just doesn't bond.
It's not going to bond.
Strength at all.
It's not going to be. There's not going to be strength to it. So it could be. Some would take this as it can be perceived as being very powerful, but it's almost like it. But it's not. It's weak, yeah. But it looks like it's powerful, but it's weak. And so that's a good way to look at it. And so this stone strikes the statue at its feet, and it falls into complete dissolution. All the metals, even the strong ones, are destroyed. But then the stone not only destroys the statue, but begins to grow as a great mountain. If you go to Isaiah 2 through 4, get a reference to that. I'll read it. I'll start. Yeah. In the future, the mountain of the Lord's temple will endure as the most important of mountains, and will be the most prominent of hills. All the nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, "Come, let us go to the Lord's mountain, to the temple of the God of Jacob, so that he can teach us his requirements and we can follow his standards. For Zion will be the center for moral instruction. The Lord will issue edicts from Jerusalem. He will judge disputes between nations. He will settle cases for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up the sword against other nations, and they will no longer train for war." So pointing to the future Jerusalem, the future time peace and prosperity, where God has put judgment upon the earth, but also has allowed the nations to come to him. So we're looking at, most likely, some would reference that as Mount Zion. The agricultural reference that we get here with the wheat and the wind and the stone together represent God's judgment to ensure that the Babylonians will be defeated. Like I said, wind is probably the Aramaic word for ruha, which also means, you've probably heard that before, means spirit. And so God, almost like it's the same sort of spirit that we see in Genesis 1, where God is hovering, or the Spirit is hovering over the waters. It's the same word for ruah. It's also the same word that's used whenever the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea is separated for the people of Israel to pass through. Same sort of wind, or ruah, was used. So we're seeing God's power, his wind, his Spirit is coming upon this and has blown the chaff of these evil nations away, and the wind has carried them away, and they're no longer could be found any longer. So just kind of give you some reference points to that. And then as we go into this next section, which we don't have time for tonight, I apologize, we'll talk about the interpretation and how Daniel breaks that down. It's a long conversation, so we don't really have time for it tonight, but we'll talk about that next time we meet. And then we'll talk about how the king is so fascinated by this, he almost treats Daniel as a god, and it gets really complicated at that
He
point.
goes out and builds a gold statue.
Yeah, it just gets
And
bad.
worships it.
We can ruminate on the interpretation for 2 weeks.
Yeah, you can.
Oh yeah, 2 weeks.
Yeah. So, and then we'll start. We'll start chapter 3 as well that week too when we get back from that. Before we go, any additional thoughts or observations?
God, I mean, Daniel just really relied on God so much that he didn't have any worries about anything. He knew that God was going to take care of things and stuff, and he didn't have to do the work. He just had to listen to God.
He did. And all he had
answers.
to do is speak what God had wanted him to speak.
Yeah.
That's amazing, isn't it? How?
Uh-huh.
But what does that tell for us? I mean, let's put a little application here. Or what, you can even go for the people who are in exile still. What did that tell them? It told them, if Daniel, like I said in the first week, they believe that if Daniel can do this, then we can do this. If Daniel can go up against Nebuchadnezzar, we can do this. We have hope. We're a nation that's filled with hope, knowing that God is with us. They didn't quite say Emmanuel at that point, but they're looking towards that future of the Messiah, and they're looking towards the future of God's restoring them as a nation. So it's even with all this symbolism and all this time where you think that Daniel at any moment could get killed by this crazed lunatic king, he survives because God's with him. So it's a great book on hope. And
Got one observation
Yes, sir.
for you.
Mhm.
I think I've got a chronological Bible here. And we came to Daniel.
Mhm.
Daniel is spread all through the remaining chapters in this book. I mean, you can't put it together like in one book at one time and say this has happened at this time. Daniel is spread all through the book
He is.
chronologically.
Right.
So you can't like we were talking about the first and second chapters.
Uh-huh.
It's hard to pinpoint
Right.
when exactly that was written. Of course, it was written after things happened.
Right.
It
Yeah.
doesn't happen immediately.
Yes.
But chronological, it's really tough.
It's a story of
Through this.
Daniel, not a chronological life of Daniel. It's kind of.
Well, that's I think a lot of the Bible's that way. It's you have the historical side of it, which is actually absolutely true, but the
Well, that's
thread
how
of it
we're
goes all the way
trained,
through
too,
the
with
books.
History,
Yeah.
you're taught
Yeah.
chronologically. I mean, just culturally today, that's just
Yeah.
how we perceive things.
Mm-hmm.
We read things A to B. We don't read, the story. We're not used to reading things out of, which I think that's why people today have trouble grasping. Not, they question things in the Bible is because they're so used to reading things chronologically, and this isn't necessarily chronologically. It's to them, it didn't matter if the story flowed from A to B. It's just
Right.
as long as the story was told,
Mhm.
and it was factual, you know.
Yeah, as long as there's factual and
I
but
mean,
it's
you can
also
go
allowed
A
them
F
to grow as a
B
country.
to D to C, you know,
Yeah.
and end up in Z, you know, all right, cool.
So true. So true. All right, let me pray and then we'll go. Again, Heavenly Father, thank you for letting us be here tonight and this great conversation we're able to have and see that the story of Daniel is about hope and the knowledge and wisdom that you provide us, knowing that you are with us and that you guide us and you are all around us and just moving us forward. And just continue to guide us in all we do and let us seek you as we continue on throughout the rest of this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Do you know all the lights by the nursery, they're all out?
Yeah, we
You know,
blew
they're
a
all
fuse.
out. What's that?
Blew a fuse, the electrician's coming
Oh,
hopefully this week.
I just didn't know if you guys knew about it.
Yeah, we tried to fix it during D now, and I almost electrocuted myself. But other than that, it's good.
I have a hard time.
That's scary.
Some deep thinking with the last